For 18 months, Iris Daly showed up at 6:45 every morning, made coffee for 12 people, and was thanked by 11 of them. The 12th was Silas Vane. She hadn't expected a thank you. Not from him. You didn't expect warmth from marble, and Silas Vane was exactly that. All hard surface and clean lines and a coldness that somehow managed to feel deliberate, like he'd chosen it the way other men choose a watch. He ran the Vane Group out of the 41st floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. Real estate development acquisitions. That was the official version. The version people whispered in the elevator, in the parking garage, in the coffee shop 3 blocks away where Iris sometimes ate lunch alone, was something else entirely. Nobody said it outright. They just said his name a certain way. Silas Vane. Like the name itself carried weight. Iris had needed the job badly enough not to ask questions. She'd come to Chicago from a small town outside of Knoxville with 2 suitcases, a paralegal certificate she'd paid for herself, and a younger brother whose dialysis wasn't going to pay for itself. The Vane Group's offer had been 2.5 times what anyone else was willing to give her. She'd signed the contract the same afternoon she received it. That was 18 months ago. In 18 months, she had learned the layout of every floor. She knew which associates stayed late on Thursdays and why. She knew that Vane's personal assistant, a precise man named Oliver, took his coffee with oat milk and got nervous whenever the elevator doors opened on the wrong floor. She knew that the board meetings ran long on the last Tuesday of every month, and that somebody always cried in the 4th floor bathroom afterward, never the same person twice. And she knew that Silas Vane had, in 18 months, never once looked directly at her. Not through her, not past her, just not at her, like she existed in some peripheral register he'd decided wasn't worth processing. She told herself it didn't bother her. She was there to work, not to be seen. She filed contracts, she cross-referenced property records, she drafted preliminary briefs that senior associates would then take credit for in meetings she wasn't invited to attend. She did it all quietly and correctly, and she went home every night to her apartment in Pilsen, and called her brother, and told him everything was fine. Everything was fine. It was a Tuesday in late October when things stopped being fine. The elevator doors opened, and Iris stepped out onto the 41st floor, holding a box of files she'd been asked to deliver personally because the internal mail system had flagged something, and nobody trusted the interns with paper that sensitive. She was wearing the gray blazer she wore when she wanted to feel competent, which was most days, and her hair was down because the clip had broken that morning on the train, and she hadn't had time to fix it. She almost walked straight into the man coming the other direction. Whoa, hey, careful. He caught the edge of the box with one hand and grabbed her elbow with the other, steadying her. She looked up. Mid-30s, sandy hair, an easy smile that looked like it had been there for years. You okay? I'm fine, she said automatically. I'm sorry, I wasn't. Don't apologize, entirely my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going. He glanced at the box. That looks heavy. You need help finding somewhere? I'm just delivering these to Oliver. Oliver's desk is right there. He pointed. I'm Brennan, by the way. Brennan Holt. I'm consulting on the Harbor South project. Iris, she said. I work on the 38th floor. Iris. He said it like he was testing how it sounded. That's a great name. She laughed. Actually laughed, a short surprised sound, because nobody had ever said that to her before. Not in exactly that way. Thank you. I've had it a while. It suits you. He held the box while she repositioned her grip. I'll probably be up here most of the week. Will I see you around? Maybe, she said. Depends on how many sensitive files need hand delivering. He grinned. I'll put in a request. She was still smiling when she set the box on Oliver's desk. Oliver looked up, then looked past her, and then his expression did something she'd never seen it do before. It went careful. She turned around. Silas Vane was standing at the end of the corridor. He was always difficult to read. That was the thing about him. His face didn't give you much to work with. But he was looking at the spot where she was standing, and then his eyes moved, very briefly, to where Brennan Holt was now walking toward the conference room, and then back to her. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked into his office and closed the door. Iris picked up her empty box and went back to the elevator. She didn't think about it again. Or she tried not to. The next morning, she came in at 6:45 and made coffee for 12 people, and delivered the 11 cups to the people who acknowledged her existence, and left the 12th, black, no sugar, on the corner of the conference table where Silas Vane would find it during his 7 a.m. review of the overnight market reports. She was halfway back to the elevator when she heard him speak. "You've been making this coffee." She stopped. She turned around slowly. He was standing in the doorway of the conference room, holding the cup, looking at her with an expression she didn't have a category for. "Yes," she said, "for about a year and a half." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise, something more deliberate than that. "It's better than what Oliver makes," he said. She didn't know what she was supposed to say to that. "I use a different ratio." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the way people nod when a meeting has concluded, and went back into the conference room. Iris pressed the elevator button and stared at the number above the doors as it counted down. Her heart was beating faster than it had any business doing. She didn't tell herself it didn't mean anything. She was 26 years old, and she had a brother who needed her, and a job she couldn't afford to complicate, and she was entirely capable of not reading into a man noticing that his coffee tasted different. She was a practical person. Knoxville had made her practical. She went back to the 38th floor, and she worked until 7, and she went home. Brennan Holt stopped by the 38th floor on Wednesday. He said he'd been looking for the printer room, but she suspected that wasn't entirely true because the printer room was clearly labeled and he didn't have anything to print. They talked for 12 minutes. She knew because she had a deadline and she was tracking the time, not because she was counting. He told her he was from Austin originally, that he'd been consulting for about 6 years, that he had a dog named Walter who was aggressively mediocre at catching things. She laughed again, that same surprised sound, and he looked pleased about it in a way that wasn't unkind. "Lunch?" he said. "I usually eat at my desk." "That sounds bleak." "It's efficient." "Iris." He said her name like he'd decided it was worth saying carefully. "Efficient isn't the same as good. Come have lunch. 1 hour. I know a place on Michigan Avenue that does a chicken sandwich that will make you reconsider every life decision that led you to eating at your desk." She went. She didn't know why she went, except that she was tired and he was easy and the sandwich was, objectively, excellent. They were back by 1:15. At 1:17, Oliver called her desk and said that Mr. Vane needed the Hargrove documents reviewed by end of day, and would she please come up to collect the relevant files. She went up. Silas Vane was in his office, standing at the window, which he apparently did when he was thinking because she'd seen it in profile from the corridor before. The city spread out below him in all its midday flatness, all gray water and glass. He turned when she came in, but he didn't look at her the way he'd looked at her yesterday in the corridor. He looked at her the way he usually looked at people, efficiently, gathering information, moving on. Except he didn't move on immediately. "Oliver tells me you were out at lunch," he said. She blinked. "I have a lunch break." "I know." He turned back to the window. "The Hargrove files are on the table. The 3rd tab is incomplete. I need you to pull the original survey records from the county database and cross-reference the boundary lines before you write the summary. I can have it by 5. 4 would be better." "4," she said. She picked up the files and walked out of his office and stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself move. He had never once mentioned her lunch break. In 18 months he hadn't acknowledged that she took one. She had it done by 3:45. She slid it under Oliver's door without saying anything and went back downstairs. That night she called her brother. His name was Patrick, and he was 23 and funnier than he had any right to be given everything that had happened to them. He asked about her week. She told him about the chicken sandwich. "Sounds like you have a work friend," he said. "Maybe." "Is he cute?" "Patrick." "What? I'm asking for morale purposes." "He's fine," she said. "He has a dog." "Cute and dog-owning. You're going to fall in love." I'm going to hang up. "Iris, come on, you're allowed to." "I know what I'm allowed," she said. But she said it gently because she knew he worried. She didn't see Silas Vane the next day, or the day after that. On Friday, she and Brennan had coffee in the building lobby because the weather had turned and going outside felt aggressive. He showed her a picture of Walter, who was a mid-sized brown dog with an expression of deep philosophical resignation. She told him Walter looked like he was reconsidering his life choices, and Brennan laughed so loud that two people at the adjacent table looked over. She didn't notice the man standing near the lobby entrance until she was already standing to throw away her cup. Silas Vane was there. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone. But she had the strange, irrational sense that he had been standing there for a moment before she noticed, and that the phone had appeared recently. She said goodbye to Brennan and walked toward the elevator bank. She had to pass within 10 feet of Silas Vane to get there. He looked up when she was 4 feet away, not because she made a sound, just he looked up. "Miss Daly," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She stopped. "Mr. Vane." The Hargrove summary was thorough. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, but there was nothing dismissive in it. The boundary analysis was more detailed than what I requested. I thought the discrepancy in the eastern parcel was relevant. It was. He held her gaze for just a beat longer than was strictly professional. "Good work." And then he walked past her and got into the elevator that was already waiting. She stood in the lobby and thought, 18 months. 18 months of good work, and not a single word. And now, suddenly, twice in 1 week. She was not naive. She was a practical person from Knoxville who had learned young not to construct narratives around scraps. So, she did not construct one. She went upstairs, and she worked, and she did not think about the way he'd said her name, like he'd been holding it somewhere, and was only now deciding to use it. She did not think about it. The following week, Brennan asked if she wanted to see a movie on Saturday. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it on Tuesday and Wednesday, and said yes by Thursday because there was no reasonable objection. And she was lonely in ways she didn't always let herself admit. And Brennan was kind, and he laughed at the right moments. And Walter, the dog, existed as evidence of a good character. She was on the 41st floor Thursday afternoon when she mentioned it, not to Vane. To Oliver, while they were sorting through a stack of misdirected correspondence. She mentioned it incidentally, the way you mention things that are incidental. Oliver said, "That sounds nice," and then looked at his stapler with unusual intensity. She didn't understand why until she looked up and realized Silas Vane's office door, which had been open, was now closed. She didn't know when it had closed. Saturday was good. The movie was fine, a thriller with a third act that strained credibility, and she said so on the walk back to the train, and Brennan agreed, and they spent 11 minutes debating the specific point at which the plot had lost its grip on logic. He walked her to the Red Line entrance. He smiled at her the way he'd been smiling at her since the hallway with the box of files. Easy and genuine and without agenda. "Same time next week," he said. "Maybe," she said. "I'll check my schedule." He nodded like that was a fine answer and said goodnight. She was in the elevator of her building when her phone buzzed. A work email. On a Saturday evening. From Silas Vane. It was 3 lines. A question about a property summary she'd filed the previous week. A specific, legitimate question. Nothing that warranted a Saturday evening response, but nothing egregious either. She stood in her apartment and read it 3 times. Then she typed a clear, professional, 4-sentence reply and sent it and put her phone face down on the counter and made herself a cup of tea. Monday arrived. She came in at 6:45. She made the coffee. She delivered 11 cups and left the 12th on the conference table. At 7:15, the cup was gone. At 7:16, her desk phone rang. "Come up," Oliver said. "Mr. Vane wants to discuss the Whitmore acquisition." She had been tangentially involved in the Whitmore acquisition in the sense that she'd filed some preliminary documents 3 months ago and not heard about it since. She went up. Silas Vane was sitting at the conference table, which was unusual. He usually stood. He had the Whitmore files open in front of him and a second chair pulled out at the table, which was also unusual because in every meeting she'd been in, the few she'd been invited to, she'd stood. He gestured to the chair. She sat. He walked her through the acquisition details for 40 minutes. He asked for her analysis on 3 separate points. He listened when she answered, and not in the performative way some of the senior associates listened, leaning back, nodding too much, waiting for their turn. He was actually still. He wrote 2 things down. When they were done, she stood to leave. The consulting arrangement with Holt, he said. It concludes at the end of the month. She turned around. I know, the Harbor South project is almost finalized. Yes. He looked at the table for a moment. You've been working closely with him. She was careful with her voice. I've spoken with him a few times. He's been helpful on some cross-referencing questions. Vane looked up. Is that what it is? It wasn't a question. She held his gaze because she was from Knoxville, and she had been taking care of herself since she was 19, and she was not going to look at her shoes. Mr. Vane, is there something you'd like to ask me directly? A long silence. Something shifted in his face. Not an opening. That would be too generous a word. More like a door that had been locked for a long time, and someone had finally checked to see if the key still worked. No, he said, that's all. She nodded and walked out. She got into the elevator and pressed 38 and stood very still while the doors closed. He was not a man who asked things directly. She understood that. She'd spent 18 months watching him operate, watching him acquire and negotiate and build, and he moved through every situation with total control, total precision. He did not fumble. He did not second-guess. So the fumble when it happened was something she felt rather than saw. It happened on a Wednesday. She was in the break room on the 38th floor heating up soup when Brennan appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath like he'd taken the stairs. He had a manila folder in one hand and a slightly sheepish look on his face. I told myself I was coming to return this, he said, holding up the folder. But the filing cabinet is 3 floors up, so. She smiled. So? He came and leaned against the counter beside her. They talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the fact that Walter had chewed through another phone charger, a restaurant on the north side she'd mentioned offhand, that he'd actually looked up and tried. He was recounting the experience, doing a voice for the hostess that made her laugh, when she became aware of someone in the doorway. She looked over. Silas Vane was standing there. He was not the kind of man who wandered onto the wrong floor. He never appeared where he wasn't expected. She had never in 18 months seen him in the break room on 38, because there was no reason for him to be there. Ever. He looked at her, then at Brennan, then at her again. Brennan, who had good instincts or at least adequate ones, stopped mid-sentence. Mr. Vane, Iris said. I was looking for the Hendricks brief, Vane said. Oliver said it was sent to 38 by mistake. I can check the intake desk, she said. I'll send someone. He didn't move. The 3 of them stood in the break room in a configuration that nobody had a clean way out of, and then Vane said, Holt, the Harbor South addendum needs a signature before you leave today. Of course, Brennan said pleasantly. I'll come up before 4. Vane nodded. He looked at Iris one more time. Not quickly, not in a way that was easy to dismiss or explain. Then he left. Brennan waited until his footsteps had faded. Well, he said. Don't, Iris said. I'm not saying anything. You're thinking very loudly. He pressed his lips together in a way that suggested he was trying very hard not to smile. He was on the wrong floor. He said there was a brief. Iris. He was on the wrong floor. She put her soup back in the microwave and pressed 30 more seconds and stared at the rotating bowl and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that didn't open a door. She wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. Brennan didn't push. That was one of his better qualities. He picked up his folder and said he'd see her around and left her to her soup. She went back to her desk. At 4:58, she received a calendar invitation from Oliver. A meeting. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., 41st floor, small conference room. No other attendees listed. Just her name and Silas Vane's. The subject line said, Whitmore follow-up. She accepted. She arrived at 8:55. Oliver brought water. He set 2 glasses on the table and then became very interested in his own desk for the duration. Vane arrived at 9 exactly. He set a folder down and sat and looked across the table at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "There isn't a whit more follow-up," he said. She had suspected as much. "No. I wanted to speak with you without context." She waited. He looked at his folder, then back at her. "You've been here 18 months. Yes. I was aware of your work. From early on." He said it with an effort she recognized, not the effort of someone inventing things, but of someone who was constitutionally uncomfortable with exposure and was doing it anyway. "I was aware you were capable, more than capable. But you never said so." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then, because I made a decision, when I structured this organization, to maintain certain separations, certain distances. It keeps things cleaner. And when Brennan Holt started coming to see me on the 30th floor, that's when things stopped feeling clean." He said it simply, no deflection. She looked at him. "So you noticed me because someone else did?" "I noticed you before." His voice was careful. "I chose not to act on it. That's different." "Is it?" Another silence. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in November. Wind off the lake, sky the color of unfinished business. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and he said it like the words cost him something. "I'm aware that I handled the last 18 months badly, that I made you invisible when you weren't. That's not. It wasn't about your value. It was about mine. Mine was the problem." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My brother is 23. He's been sick for 4 years. I took this job because the pay is real and I needed real. I didn't take it to be seen or validated or whatever you're describing. I took it to work." "I know. But I'm a person," she said, "who has been in this building for a year and a half doing good work and eating lunch at her desk and not asking for anything. And it turns out I do care about being seen. Not by everyone. But—" She stopped. "But," he said, quiet. "But yes," she said, "it would have mattered if you had looked up earlier." He held her gaze. "It matters now." "I know it does." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm just not sure what to do with that." "That's fair. I'm not going to make this easy for you." Something in him shifted. Not the door this time, but something behind it, something that might, in a different light, have been relief. "I wouldn't expect you to." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "There's a property issue in the Whitmore file that actually does need review. The eastern parcel boundary comes up again. Different development, same problem." He reached for the folder. "Show me." She pulled her chair around to his side of the table and she showed him, and they worked for the next 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour, he said her name. Iris, not Miss Daly, and it landed the way she'd somehow known it would. Not like a beginning. Like a door that had been there the whole time, finally opening. Brennan Holt finished the Harbor South project on a Friday and stopped by the 38th floor to say goodbye. He was going to Denver next, he said. Some mixed-use development near the foothills. He shook her hand and held it for a moment and smiled the smile that had always been easy and warm and offered without conditions. "I hope it works out," he said, not unkindly, like he knew. "Thank you," she said. "For the sandwich?" He laughed, surprised, genuine, and walked away. She went upstairs at 5:45, which was past when most people had left. The 41st floor was quiet. Oliver was gone. The cleaning crew hadn't come yet. She knocked on the open door. Silas Vane looked up from his desk. "I thought you'd left," he said. "I had some things to finish." She stood in the doorway. "I wanted to ask if you'd eaten." He looked at her for a long moment. The city behind him had gone dark and orange, all that glass catching the last of the light. "I hadn't," he said. "There's a place on Wabash," she said. "Nothing impressive, good food." He closed the folder in front of him. He stood up. He said, "Lead the way." And Iris Daly, who had come to Chicago with 2 suitcases and a paralegal certificate and absolutely no expectation of being seen, turned and walked toward the elevator, and for the first time in 18 months heard footsteps following. I keep thinking about the box of files. That's the detail that stays with me, not the grand moment, not the confession in the conference room. Just Iris carrying a box of sensitive documents to a floor she rarely visited, almost colliding with a stranger, and laughing. One genuine, unguarded laugh. And somehow that laugh did what 18 months of excellent work hadn't. There's something uncomfortable in that, if you sit with it long enough. We tell ourselves that doing good work is enough, that showing up, being reliable, being thorough, that these things eventually get seen. And maybe they do, but Iris's story suggests the timeline on that can be brutally long, and sometimes it takes something entirely outside your control to accelerate it. That's not a comforting lesson. But I think it's an honest one. What I respect about Iris is that she never performed her worth. She didn't shrink herself to make Silas Vane comfortable, and she didn't chase his attention once it arrived. When he finally looked up, she didn't rush toward him grateful for the scraps of recognition. She said, plainly and without drama, "I am a person who has been here, doing real work, and it would have mattered if you'd looked sooner." That kind of clarity, knowing what you deserved before anyone confirmed it, that's not something you can fake. It comes from the inside. It comes from a long practice of being honest with yourself about your own value even when the room isn't reflecting it back. Silas Vane is a harder case. He isn't a villain, which almost makes it worse. He's someone who saw something worth seeing and made a deliberate choice to look away, not out of cruelty, but out of a need for control. He built distance because distance felt safe, and then, when he thought he might lose access to something he'd never even acknowledged wanting, that distance collapsed. I've known people like that. I've probably been like that, in smaller ways. The instinct to protect yourself by not naming what you want is very human. It's also, eventually, a way of cheating yourself. What changed him wasn't jealousy exactly. It was consequence. The moment Brennan Holt walked into the frame, Silas understood, maybe for the first time, that his indifference had a cost, that Iris wasn't a fixed point, that she existed fully outside of his awareness of her, and that other people could see what he'd been refusing to look at. That's what cracked him open. Not sentiment. Cause and effect, clean and simple. I think about Patrick, too. 23 years old, sick, funny, asking his sister if her co-worker is cute for morale purposes. He knew what Iris sometimes forgot, that being practical doesn't mean being closed, that survival and softness aren't opposites. She'd spent so long being the person who holds things together that she'd stopped expecting anyone to notice the weight. That's the part of her story that I carry, not the romance. The 18 months before it. The discipline it takes to keep showing up with full effort when nobody is watching. The intelligence to read a room without letting it diminish you, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to become bitter when the recognition is slow. She walked to that elevator at the end carrying nothing she didn't come in with, just herself, and that was exactly enough.